Contacted by an alien, the shocking truth behind 3i/Atlas that NASA didn't want you to know. The room smelled like sandalwood and rain. A single lamp cast a pool of amber light over a low table where crystals had been arranged like a compass. Soft music hummed through the speakers, a slow wash of tones just below hearing, a barely noticeable thrum that made the air feel thicker. Marcos lay face up on the treatment table, a blanket pulled to his chest, the tightness in his lower back visible in the way his jaw clenched under the dim light. Sophia sat at his side, hands hovering, palms radiating a warmth she called listening. She had done thousands of sessions like this. She had never expected tonight to dissolve into something that would redraw her sense of the sky. "I remember the room like a photograph, only brighter," she would say later. But what happened next felt like a different kind of seeing. At first, it was a change in frequency. Everything small in the room, the tick of a clock, the hum of the heater, sank a half step. The candle flame, which had been steady, shuddered as if responding to a bass note. Sophia felt the sensation as a body-deep suggestion, like when your phone vibrates in another room and you feel it as adrenaline in your palms. The air itself seemed to gather, as if the space were contracting into a single focused point just above Marcos's chest. Then the light arrived. It did not enter the room so much as cause the room to arrange itself around a light that was already there. It was simultaneously golden and silver. If you try to name it by color, the memory flickers between both. It was not a glare that burned the eyes. It was a density that filled the visual field with geometry, facets, filaments, and a slow rotational pattern like a galaxy turning under a microscope. Sophia describes the sensation as similar to stepping into a story she had once been shown in a dream, an ancient machine singing into the human body. Marcos, who had come that evening for chronic back pain and, as he later admitted, more to humor his wife than to change his life, blinked more slowly than normal. He remembers a pressure behind the eyes and then a sense that a thought he had not formed was being handed to him from elsewhere. He later told Sophia, "It was like someone had typed a memory into my head that I never owned." The voice was not spoken aloud. It arrived as a vivid inner message, clearer than any thought and distinct from any of their inner monologues. Sophia, who trained herself over a decade and a half to discern energetic impressions, recognized it as a transmission in a mode she had only encountered a handful of times: telepathic contact, direct and intentional. Telepathic transmission as perceived by Sophia and Marcos. "You have found the seam. Listen, this is not a passing flint. This is a thread." Sophia describes how the room readied them, how the music, the candlelight, and even the posture of Marcos seemed to be coaxed into surrender. In her telling, the presence did not feel hostile. It carried a softness that was both intensely old and urgently present. The being's voice, as Sophia and Marcos experienced it, contained layers, an emotional tone, a pattern of images, and phrases that arrived like a series of keys unlocking different doors in memory. "What is your name?" Sophia asked aloud, partly to anchor herself, partly to test the honesty of the experience. Telepathic transmission. "Names are garments. I am the messenger for the construct you call Atlas. We come as pattern and recall." Sophia later told me, reclined in a different light in her own kitchen, that the word Atlas had no emotional weight for her in that moment, only a resonance, like a chord that aligned some bracketed place in her nervous system. She had, like many in her field, read the headlines, a distant object cataloged in the public eye as 3i.Atlas, reported by astronomers and discussed in online communities. What she had not expected was the presence to claim that that public story was incomplete. This is where the story pivots from the ordinary to the extraordinary. I will be careful here. Everything that follows is presented as Sophia's testimony,
what she perceived and the meanings she and Marcos derived from the encounter. It is not an independently verified scientific report. It is an eyewitness account given in good faith by someone who has worked for years with altered states, sympathetic resonance, and phenomena that operate at the edge of measurable instruments. After the initial exchange, Sophia felt a movement inside her field that she likened to being pulled through a corridor of music. The telepathic presence guided her, not with commands, but with rhythm. In a matter of seconds, or what felt like a stretch of minutes, her awareness widened outward, out of the room, above the building, above the city. The walls of space dissolved into a plane of light, and for the first time she perceived the object in question at scale. She describes Atlas as something intentionally constructed. Imagine a jewel the size of a small moon, its surface faceted like a cut crystal, but with panels that slid into patterns that resembled both architecture and algorithm. It pulsed with a low, deep beat that wasn't heard so much as embodied. Sophia perceived the beat as a frequency that mapped onto a tone roughly around 528 cycles per second. The number later repeated to me several times as if the shape of the number itself carried the memory. As the vision continued, the presence, this luminous envoy, translated not in words but in images and affect. Sophia saw strands of light, tiny filaments, raining out from the construct like seeds. They threaded into the atmosphere, they threaded into human minds.
The being's transmission contained an explanation. Atlas was not a random wanderer from interstellar space, it claimed. It was an engineered emitter, a device designed to sing a specific tone into a receptive field. We tune, we remind, awake the code. Those two words, awake the code, became the hinge of the entire experience. To a healer like Sophia, whose practice had always been about unblocking, reminding, and aligning, the concept of code activation did not appear as a technical claim, but as an intimate rewrite, a call to memory embedded in the living fabric of human biology. The presence did not explain DNA like a lecture. It delivered a metaphor that Sophia later repeated. Humans carry an archive, some of it folded down, some of it unread. The transmission is a key for parts that have been labeled silent by modern science. According to the witness, Atlas's emission resonates with these sleeping registers and invites them to be remembered. Again, this is Sophia's interpretation of what she perceived. The specific phrase, dormant DNA, the mapping to 528 Hz, and the idea that a single frequency can open latent capacities are all positions she derived from the encounter. Positions she offers as experiential truth, not as lab-confirmed findings. When the vision receded and Sophia's awareness returned to the physical room, both she and Marcos were crying, not out of pain, but out of a sudden, overwhelming flood of recognition. Marcos later told me that his back pain, which had been lodged in him for months, felt different. Not immediately gone, but as if a new template had been slid under the old one. For Sophia, the session had been a doorway. She had seen what she described as a mechanism, Atlas as an intentional transmitter emitting a harmonic that aligned certain human registers. The being left them with a timeline, an opening and an urgency that lingered in her chest. There are two moments in the retelling that we need to pause on. The first is the specificity of the frequency, 528 Hz. The second is the timeline the being indicated, a gradual increase in emissions culminating in a critical, concentrated peak at approximately 10 weeks from the day of contact, a surge with a 48-hour maximum window when effects would become widespread and harder to dismiss. Before I continue, a short word. If any of this is landing on you in a way that feels personally relevant, if you have had unusual dreams, sudden expansions of perception, or strange synchronistic floods,
There are ways to track those experiences and protect your well-being that do not require belief in a single cosmology. The woman telling this story encourages journaling, grounding, and checking in with medical and mental health professionals when physical or psychological symptoms intensify. And if you want to follow this account as it unfolds, subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated with the full investigation into what Sophia witnessed. That invitation is the only one I will make now. Back to the evening. Over the next week, Sophia reported a cascade of after effects. She slept less deeply but more vividly. Symbols pressed against the back of her eyelids, geometric glyphs, spirals folding into themselves, and the persistent exhale of an oceanic tone that her body registered in the base of the skull. Wordless images of ancient places came, pillared halls, circular stonework, star maps carved in bas-relief. She took notes, drew the impressions, and began to see patterns. Other people in her network, clients she had not yet mentioned the session to, started sending messages about abrupt dream changes and an increase in synchronistic events. Marcos's experience was more anchored to the physical. At work, he noticed that decisions he had been mulling over made themselves clearer. He found it easier to feel the edges of possibilities, as if an internal map had sharpened. He also experienced auditory phenomena, a low tone at the edge of hearing that would arrive in quiet moments and then pass. It didn't hurt. Rather, it felt like a tuning fork struck in another room. Time and testimony will determine how these subjective reports map onto measurable change. What matters for understanding the social dynamics that follow is that Sophia moved quickly to do two things simultaneously. She worked to integrate the experience personally, and she sought validation from other witnesses. This dual move, processing inwardly and seeking outward confirmation, became the pattern for what would emerge in the following weeks. One afternoon, after several people reported similar dream motifs, and a friend forwarded a grainy amateur telescope image of a bright object streaking across the sky, Sophia decided she needed to try something more daring. She would follow the perception where it had shown her atlas and attempt to verify whether what she saw correlated to anything in the material record. Sophisticated instrumentation or astrophysical credentials were not part of her toolkit. But she had something else, a long network of friends in fields ranging from amateur astronomy to radio techs to other energy workers who logged anomalous phenomena. The first results were ambiguous and typical of early-stage investigative work in this realm. People sent links. A new object had been cataloged, 3I/Atlas. Telescopes had picked it up. Papers discussed its trajectory, and online forums debated its origin. The public record labeled it as an interstellar visitor, an object passing through our system. Sophia's testimony was that what she had perceived was not a passing cometary body, but a deliberate transmitter. Here we must be careful with wording. Sophia claimed that Atlas was constructed, that it emitted a harmonic designed to interact with human biological fields, and that the pattern she was shown aligned to the number 528 Hz. Scientists and skeptics routinely ask two important questions here. One, could a frequency from space at that distance and in that medium reach terrestrial organisms in a meaningful way? Two, are the subjective reports consistent across independent witnesses in ways that allow for prediction and replication? The first is a technical physical question that requires instruments and modeling to answer. The second is an empirical social question familiar to ethnographers and field researchers. Do narratives converge, and if so, what patterns do they reveal? Sophia's approach to these questions was not academic. She began to collect narratives. She organized informal calls, posted an open invitation for others who had experienced unusual resonance since the Atlas event, and she started a notebook of small, testable observations, dreams with similar motifs, a sudden sensitivity to tones, reports of inexplicable warmth in the hands, shifts in appetite or sleep, and one surprisingly recurrent detail, an uptick in synchronicities, Meaningful coincidences that, while subjective, left participants changed in how they perceived agency in their lives. One afternoon in a sparse local cafe, I asked her about the feeling of urgency. "Why did it feel like a countdown?" I asked. She folded her hands and smiled, the way someone smiles before they say something they wish they didn't have to. "It wasn't a countdown the way a bomb ticks down," she told me. "It was a window. The being made it clear there was a buildup. Think of it as a tide. Tides do what they do whether you stand on the shore or not. But if you are in a boat, the difference between low tide and high tide is life-changing. They said the tide would peak in about 10 weeks. That peak would be loud, concentrated, and visible. The being said, according to how I experienced it, that during a 48-hour window, the activation would be obvious enough to force a collective choice." Those last words, collective choice, are heavy. A collective choice can mean many things: mass acceptance, denial, panic, policy decisions by authorities, or just a broad cultural shift. In Sophia's telling, the being framed the possible outcomes in ethical terms. A population choosing to accept newly awakened capacities and integrate them responsibly, or a population choosing to pathologize and suppress those changes out of fear. The latter, she said, was the outcome the being warned against. If this account had remained only within the intimate circle of Sophia and Marcos, it would still be meaningful to them. But the story gains traction because Sophia's visions also included a scene that, whether visionary or demonstrative, carried socio-political implications.
In one striking sequence, she recalled as a visionary reconstruction, Sophia perceived a control room tableau. Teams of analysts bent over banks of monitors, a senior figure who made a hard classification call, and a stream of language that outlined how the information would be handled. I will emphasize again, the following is described by Sophia as what she perceived in an expanded state of consciousness. It is not an official leak, and none of the conversation she reports is documented in a public record as far as independent checks could confirm at the time of this recording. Presenting it as a witness perception is necessary both for accuracy and for legal caution. In the vision, the control room was cold-lit and efficient. A young analyst leaned forward, excitement contained in a whisper. She wanted to flag the object's unusual harmonic signature and publish. A senior official, composed and wary, raised concerns about the social consequences of an unfiltered disclosure. The language, as Sophia perceived it, moved quickly from technical classification to the politics of publication. How would the public respond to hearing that a manufactured emitter was operating in near-Earth space? How might markets, institutions, and fragile social orders react? Visionary reconstruction, control room as perceived by Sophia. The analyst. The waveform isn't noise, it's patterned, coherent. If we model, the official, we classify anomalous, hold publication, assess societal impact, contain messaging. The scene, as Sophia recounted it, concluded with an order that the object's nature be described in public messaging in ways that downplayed intent, catalog as interstellar object, emphasize trajectory and composition, avoid language that implies agency. According to Sophia, the conscious choice to label the object in certain ways effectively framed public understanding. Whether or not that is how real institutional processes actually played out, the narrative she offers is clear: a mechanism of containment, a decision to control the framing of the phenomenon in order to manage the possibility of destabilizing social response. That claim, that governmental or scientific institutions might prioritize social stability, resonates with many historical precedents, where authorities chose to withhold or gate information to prevent perceived panic. Sophia's account takes that observation and slides it into a different register, that of an active decision to manage the meaning of an event with spiritual and existential implications. Again, I stress the boundary.
These scenes are Sophia's reports of what she saw in her inner vision. They are not presented here as independently corroborated institutional fact. They are, however, crucial for understanding how she moved from the personal to the public. If the object cataloged as 3I Atlas was presented to the world as a comet, then the choice to frame it as such, according to her experience, would have consequences for what people were prepared to perceive. From her vantage, the stakes were both immediate and durable. In her telling, the transmission of 528 Hz was not a one-off. It was a sustained, increasing signal. It entered the human field and found consonance in systems the being called codes. Those codes, Sophia described them as archival pockets in the body, contained capacities that could amplify healing, sharpen intuition, open threads of telepathy, accelerate manifestation of intentions, and create a direct sense of connection to Source. She offered the list not as magical promises, but as emergent capacities, amplifications of potentials that have always lived in human biology, but had been dormant, underused, or socially suppressed. It's important to be clear and responsible here. Sophia's language did not promise guaranteed cures or miraculous recoveries for everyone. She was careful to insist that individual outcomes would vary and that medical care should not be abandoned. What she did assert, repeatedly, was that some people would experience clear shifts that felt like new capacities, an ability to sense another's emotional state without words, faster intuitive problem-solving, or surprising bodily resilience to stress. These shifts, she said, might be easy to dismiss in small numbers, but in a large enough window, if many people experience them simultaneously, the cultural result would no longer be ignorable. That possibility is what, in Sophia's testimony, brought the attention of the control room into sharper relief. If a significant portion of a population started to report enhanced capacities that challenged existing medical, psychological, and social frameworks, the reaction from institutions could range from curiosity and accommodation to pathologization and suppression. Sophia and the being both framed this as a moral crossroads. Choice, not coercion, would determine the long-term outcome. We pause again. Is there evidence that institutions have a tendency to control narratives? Yes, this is a sociological and historical observation. Does Sophia's testimony provide objective proof that a specific institution deliberately hid the nature of Atlas? No, not in terms that could be legally or scientifically verified at the time of this report. It is a claim she makes on the basis of the visionary sequence she experienced. For some listeners, that will be persuasive. For others, it will be insufficient. Both responses are legitimate. What follows from here is a story that broadens its scope. Sophia becomes not just a witness, but also a caller to a larger conversation. She began to form a small community of early recipients, people who resonated with her experience and whose reports overlapped in surprising ways.
They compared notes, cataloged patterns, and, crucially, practiced a method Sophia insisted upon: validation. Validation, in her teaching, was a simple but radical act. When someone reported an unusual dream, a burst of intuition, or a physical sensation aligned to the time of invisible emissions, the community's first response was to listen without immediate pathologizing. They offered phrases meant to normalize experience rather than to diagnose it away. 3 simple sentences became their toolkit. I hear you. This might be important, and would you like to sit with me while we record what happened? This approach, Sophia argued, reduced the risk of shaming and minimized the chance that early recipients would self-isolate in confusion, exactly the condition that, she believed, the control structures would prefer if they wanted to keep the phenomenon muted. The communal work also had an investigative edge. Sophia coordinated with an amateur radio operator who monitored low-frequency bands. He reported intermittent bursts that, when windowed and slowed, showed patterned coherence rather than the stochastic hiss most background noise displays. Again, this is not definitive proof. It is a data point that, in Sophia's network, compounded with subjective reports to create a mounting pattern,
a persistent, low-frequency phenomenon paired with subjective experiences across different locales. One evening, as the 10-week horizon moved visibly closer, a particular image kept returning to Sophia's mind. A lattice of human hands, each palm pressed to the chest of a person in a circle, faces radiating the same slow calm she had seen in Marcos that night. In her telling, the being had said that the activation was not about supremacy or power. It was about remembering lines of connection. She framed the work as a reclaiming of memory, of capacity, of relational attunement. "What did the being ask you to do?" I asked when we spoke in her garden under a crescent moon. "It didn't command," she answered. "It invited. It said, 'Prepare the grounds.' That's what I took it to mean. Prepare people to receive, to listen without immediate dismissal, to plant intentions in community rather than in isolation. It is in this invitation, that language of preparation and of community, that the story begins to fracture into two overlapping narratives: the internal, spiritual one of personal awakening, and the public, political one of how institutions might react. Between these two tracks lie 1,000 human moments. Doctors puzzled by new symptoms, neighbors sharing unlikely coincidences, friends waking to a shared dream. Sophia's testimony ties these micro-events to a macro pattern, an engineered emitter, a harmonic frequency, a rising tide. As the weeks pass in Sophia's account, the emotional register tightens. Early recipients become more willing to speak. Small pockets of validation spread. Some physicians, when approached, shrugged and advised routine testing. Others, anecdotally, reported puzzling improvements in certain patients' recovery rates that could not be easily explained. Again, these are individual narratives. They require study. But the accumulation of cases, Sophia argued, made the question of institutional framing urgent. If people began reporting abilities inconsistent with established models, the path chosen by influential institutions could determine whether those experiences were integrated or ostracized. If you imagine this like an approaching storm, the control room sequence was Sophia's vision of those deciding whether to issue weather warnings and what kind. A reluctance to say something unprecedented is happening could keep much of society anchored in a frame that would discount incredible but potentially constructive experiences. Conversely, a transparent, humane approach could allow for guided integration, psychological support, medical oversight, and public education, reducing harm and enabling the benefits Sophia and others anticipated. That interplay between the technical, the spiritual, and the social sets the stage for what she and her circle would soon call the weeks of testing. In the days that followed the initial session, Sophia cataloged sensory reports, coordinated with others who had experienced similar visits or dream sequences, and, quietly, prepared the small rituals and practices she would suggest to people who contacted her. Those practices were not exotic. They were rooted in grounding, breath, and attentiveness, tools meant to stabilize rather than to expand recklessly. But before she had a chance to develop a public curriculum, she described another sequence in which the being, through her perception, offered a more explicit chronology. The emissions were rising. According to what she perceived, the strength of the signal would escalate incrementally over the following weeks and crest in a brief but intense surge. It was as if the construct in orbit was winding, like a watch spring, toward a release. That release, Sophia was told, would be a concentrated opportunity, a 48-hour stretch in which potentials would bloom in a way that would compress disbelief and force a societal reaction. "Why 48 hours?" I asked, trying to parse whether the number had symbolic weight or technical claim. "It came like a picture," she said, "not numbers alone. Imagine a floodlight turned briefly from dim to full, no gradual dusk. The being showed it as a window when the pattern of wakefulness and the pattern of signal align. So many people catch the same note at once. 48 hours is not doctrine, it's the shape I was given. The call to prepare was about that shape." The moral urgency in her voice was unmistakable. For her, the timeline converted abstract possibility into responsibility. It meant that steps taken in the coming weeks, how people listened, and how communities responded would have measurable influence on the social path.
At that point in our conversation, there was a change in her demeanor, an energy that shifted from reflective to insistently practical. She began to outline small, repeatable actions that would not require belief. Keep a journal, check sleep patterns, bring experiences to a group who will simply listen. Those steps, which she insisted were essential, are the very ones she began to teach in informal gatherings. And then she added something else that made her pause. The being's message had included a caution about response. In her vision, there were what she termed countermeasures, not in the sense of an organized global plot with clear villainy, but as predictable human and institutional responses. People in positions of influence, faced with reports of sudden, widespread, extraordinary experiences, might respond in ways that protect existing structures. That could look like pathologizing unusual experiences, attributing changes to mass hysteria, or promoting narratives that distracted attention away from meaningful integration. Sophia saw all of these as likely outcomes, scenarios she believed the being had shown not to frighten, but to prepare them for strategic guardrails. We reach now a pivot point in the story. On one side sits the luminous moment in the healing room, the intimate, disorienting, and personally transformative event that altered two people's lives. On the other side sits a widening arc, networks forming, data points being logged, a rising frequency in the air, and a control room decision that may or may not have intentionally framed public knowledge about the object known as 3I Atlas. Between them is a timeline that, in Sophia's testimony, tightens toward a critical window. That tightening is where the narrative must pause for a breath. There is more to tell, the exact ways the 5 capacities she was shown unfold in everyday life, the small tests she and her circle ran to see the signal's effects, the conversations that followed when more people reported synchronistic floods, and how the community began to prepare for the 48-hour crest. There is also the deeper arch, what it would mean if millions began to experience direct connection to a source that reoriented their sense of self. But before stepping fully into that second act, before mapping in detail the clinical anecdotes, the recorded audio snippets, and the community protocols that Sophia would coalesce into a curriculum, it's crucial to rest on the hinge we have reached. Witness to public implication, inner transmission to social consequence, and a specific timeline that converts possibility into political urgency. As dusk gathered over the city, and Sophia tucked her notes into the notebook she kept by the bed, the image that returned most vividly to her was of Atlas itself, its slow, geometric heartbeat like a deep drum that resonated not only outward but inward. She told me that she could still feel, at odd moments, a tiny pressure behind her sternum, a reminder of the contact like a watchful pulse. It was, she said, both terrifying and profoundly hopeful. When I left that night, the sky was clear. The telescopes reported a bright object, as expected. Astronomers continued their work. In the months that followed, public statements would circulate about 3I Atlas as an interstellar visitor with peculiarities worth study. What they did not include, if one accepts Sophia's account, was the more intimate story of a sentient-sounding transmission and a decision, perceived by one witness in an altered state, that the object's nature be softly reframed to avoid public alarm. From here, the story opens into several directions. For now, we stand at the shore looking toward the tide. The weeks count down in Sophia's notes. Small groups form, practices are refined, and more people raise their hands with experiences that echo the first. The narrative is no longer a private event. It has entered the domain of collective possibility. The question becomes, when the crest arrives, how will ordinary people, institutions, and cultures respond? And, more pressingly, how should those who have felt the first waves practically, ethically, and emotionally for what might come?
The next phase of this account moves into particulars, the 5 capacities, the being named, and the initial tests that community members ran. The audio samples recorded and analyzed for patterned coherence, the ways in which individual lives began to shift in small but telling ways. It will also step deeper into the visionary reconstruction of the control room deliberation, exploring the language used and the plausible incentives that could lead institutions to choose caution over disclosure. But before that, one last observation Sophia made in those early days is worth highlighting. The being did not dismiss human choice. It framed the activation as an invitation. In her words, "There is no forced awakening. The tone arrives, the work is to say yes or no, with clarity, consent, and community." That phrasing, invitation, choice, consent, became the ethical spine of the small movement that gathered around her claims, an anchor that would shape how they recorded their data, how they talked to medical professionals, and how they prepared for the approaching window. As the narrative moves forward, the lines between subjective report and public consequence will be tested. For now, the map is simple. An energy healing session became first contact in Sophia's experience. The being showed her a constructed transmitter called Atlas that sings a frequency she identified as 528 Hz. A timeline was given, a build-up to a concentrated peak in roughly 10 weeks with a critical 48-hour window, and a small community formed around validation and preparation. As the narrative moves forward, the lines between subjective report and public consequence will be tested. For now, the map is simple. An energy healing session became first contact in Sophia's experience. The being showed her a constructed transmitter called Atlas that sings a frequency she identified as 528 Hz. A timeline was given, a build-up to a concentrated peak in roughly 10 weeks with a critical 48-hour window, and a small community formed around validation and preparation.
What remains to be fully explored is how the 5 capacities unfold in the lives of ordinary people and what concrete steps will help recipients integrate responsibly when the tide rises. They began with one capacity at a time, because the story Sophia had been given wasn't a single miracle, but a set of emergent possibilities, each showing up first in marginal, traceable ways. The group called them the 5: amplified healing, heightened intuition, initial telepathy, accelerated manifestation, and direct connection to source. Each label, Sophia warned, was a map, not a guarantee. What followed were sketches from the field, small, replicable-seeming threads that anyone paying attention could log. Amplified healing appeared most often in places where care was already happening. Sophia collected accounts from massage therapists, nurses, and a handful of physiotherapists who described patients with surprisingly rapid shifts in pain tolerance and mobility. One nurse in Oregon, who agreed to be quoted only as Lena, told Sophia she saw 2 patients with similar postoperative inflammation. Both had conventional care. One also participated in a short, community-led breath and intention practice Sophia's group had recommended. Lena used clinical language. The inflammation markers did not match her usual expectations. She did not claim cures. She reported an anomaly in recovery rate that merited follow-up. Lena encouraged the patients to continue medical treatment, documented the changes, and allowed researchers from a local university to observe. In Sophia's ledger, Lena became a cautious corroborator, a professional who described something unusual without turning it into a headline. Marcos's back pain offers a grounded vignette. It did not vanish as if by magic. Rather, he described a subtle retemplating. Movements that had been painful for months became negotiable. The pain receded from the foreground as if a new support structure had been inserted. He began to resume stretching routines he'd abandoned and found his body's cues arriving with clearer timing. If he pushed too hard, a precise nudge would arrive as a micro pain rather than as full disruption. For him, the amplified healing was an increase in the feedback loop between intention, movement, and recovery,
not guaranteed, but real enough to change behavior. Heightened intuition showed up as faster internal pattern recognition. A software developer in Sophia's group reported that debugging sessions shortened. Problems that had taken days now felt visible within hours. A mother reported a shift in sensing her child's unspoken moods, catching emotional changes earlier and responding differently. These were experiences of clarity, an inner compass that seemed tuned to subtle cues.
Sophia cautioned listeners, intuition can be deceptive if not checked by evidence. The practice they taught included simple cross-checks. Name the intuition, test it against small verifiable facts, and record the outcome. The point of these tests was not to prove metaphysics, but to create a habit of accountability. Initial telepathy arrived as the most narratively charged capacity because it sounded, outwardly, the most headline-grabbing. Yet what people described were narrow phenomena: finishing a friend's sentence without prior contact, sensing when a parent was about to call, or a sudden awareness of the theme of another person's dream during a shared circle. Marcos once sat across from a woman in a support group and, without speaking, realized she had a memory of a lake from childhood. He later mentioned the image and she started, asking the exact same detail he had picked up. These early telepathic moments were fragile and easily dismissed as coincidence, which is why Sophia urged documentation. Document, test, invite consent before probing. That last requirement, consent, became a mantra. Never read someone without permission. Never assume access. Accelerated manifestation was the one that worried some skeptics most because it sounded like wish fulfillment. Yet Sophia's examples were small and mundane. Someone intending to find a lost ring and discovering it in a place they had second-guessed. A community fundraiser that exceeded modest expectations after a coordinated day of shared intention and practical outreach. A span of creative work that suddenly produced a flurry of completed tasks. Sophia called it alignment, not magic. When attention and action tightened in a predictable rhythm, outcomes shifted. In other words, manifestation seemed to amplify what people were already doing rather than spontaneously granting desires. The fifth capacity, direct connection to source, was the least easily described in objective terms because it was qualitative, an existential reorientation. People spoke of experiences of profound belonging, a sudden sense that their life had a thread connecting them to something larger. For some, it was a comfort. Others found it disorienting. A retired teacher in Sophia's circle described waking in the night with a phrase on her mind she had never heard before. In the morning, she found that phrase woven into a paper she had been writing for a community history project. She reported feeling as though her work had become part of a larger narrative. These moments did not arrive as doctrine, but as presence. To move these reports from story collection to something useful, Sophia and her collaborators developed small, replicable micro-tests, simple practices anyone could do and log. One such test, the tone note test, asked participants to sit quietly for 5 minutes, listen for any peripheral tone, and then write down the time and quality of the tone. If multiple people in different locations reported a similar low hum at overlapping times, it would be a data point. Another test, synchronicity tracking, invited people to note surprising coincidences and then check whether others had similar coincidences on the same day. The approach was epidemiological. Collect many small, subjective reports and look for patterns. This is not the same as laboratory replication, Sophia reminded everyone. But it was a necessary first step in a domain where formal institutions were, according to her, likely to be cautious. One of the group's most striking early finds was audio data. An amateur radio operator in the network, Ethan, began recording low-frequency bands around dawn and dusk. He shared a slowed-down clip with Sophia. When they expanded and windowed the audio, the waveform displayed a structure that felt less like random noise and more like patterned coherence.
Ethan was careful with his language. He did not assert that the clip proved anything definitive. He labeled his results patterned anomalies and invited further analysis. Sophia did the same. She distributed the clips among trusted friends, including a friend who was a signal processing student. The student identified periodic components at low frequency and suggested that, while the audio did not by itself confirm a biological effect, its structured nature merited more rigorous observation. In Sophia's ledger, this became both a claim and a method. Claim less, collect more. As the 10-week horizon narrowed, the control room vision Sophia had reported took on sharper contours. She described, in later sessions, a more detailed exchange. The analyst who pushed to publish had a personal affinity for openness, someone who had worked under the belief that light is the solvent of fear. The senior official, in her vision, was not a villain, but a steward whose job it was to run risk models. The conversation she heard included phrases like assess societal impact, market stability, and cultural panic models. The official argued for a careful messaging plan that emphasized orbital parameters and inert composition while downplaying agency. Visionary reconstruction, control room follow-up as perceived by Sophia. The analyst. If it's emitting patterned energy, people will feel it. We have to be transparent. The official. Transparency without context is a flashpoint. The public needs framing, economic, scientific, social, so we can avoid destabilization. The official argued for a careful messaging plan that emphasized orbital parameters and inert composition while downplaying agency. Visionary reconstruction, control room follow-up, as perceived by Sophia. The analyst. If it's emitting patterned energy, people will feel it. We have to be transparent. The official. Transparency without context is a flashpoint. The public needs framing, economic, scientific, social, so we can avoid destabilization. The official argued for a careful messaging plan that emphasized orbital parameters and inert composition while downplaying agency. Visionary reconstruction, control room follow-up, as perceived by Sophia. The analyst. If it's emitting patterned energy, people will feel it. We have to be transparent. The official. Transparency without context is a flashpoint. The public needs framing, economic, scientific, social, so we can avoid destabilization. Sophia's rendering here offered a plausible institutional calculus rather than a sinister conspiracy. The line between paternalism and prudence is fine. Her cautionary note was this: even well-meaning containment can have the effect of minimizing people's lived experiences, making it harder for early recipients to be heard and validated. That predicted reaction is what Sophia's group named the pathologize and distract script. According to her perception, the script contained several predictable moves. First, the promotion of medicalized language, mass psychosomatic responses, or misattributed sensory phenomenon to reclassify experiences as symptoms rather than as emergent capacities. Second, the deployment of distraction, saturate media cycles with unrelated spectacles that draw attention away from sustained conversation. Third, an institutional nudge toward pharmacological framing, emphasizing treatments that manage symptoms rather than explore capacities. Sophia argued that these were not conspiratorial headlines, but historical patterns, how institutions often respond to phenomena that challenge existing frameworks. She did not imagine a monolithic plan orchestrated by shadowy cabals. She described a set of systemic incentives that favored containment, reputational risk, market stability concerns, and the simple human discomfort with rapid, large-scale paradigm shifts. Power preserves itself, she told me in her kitchen, not necessarily out of malice, but out of self-protection. Preparedness, not paranoia, is the healthy response. That is where validation as resistance comes back into play. If institutions lean toward pathologization, the most immediate and low-risk countermeasure is social, to listen, document, and create community records. Sophia taught early recipients 3 simple phrases to use when someone reported an unusual experience. Phrases intended to slow the reflex to diagnose and to build a supportive field of evidence. I hear you. This might be important. Would you like to sit with me while we record what happened? These phrases, repeated and practiced in community circles, became a procedural ethic. They had 3 effects. They normalized the experience without making claims. They created documentation that could later be compared across time and place. And they prevented isolation, which Sophia believed was the most dangerous social consequence. Practical integration moved to the center of Sophia's teaching during those weeks. She stripped the curriculum down to 3 core practices that required nothing mystical and everything grounded: conscious breath with intention, synchronicity journaling, and grounding meditations. Each practice was banal in its simplicity, but rigorous in its repetition. Conscious breath with intention was a 5-minute protocol. Sit in a stable chair. Breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, breathe out for 6 counts, and set a simple intention. 1 sentence, future tense, and verifiable. For example, I will notice the next 3 times I experience a vivid dream. Repeat twice daily. The purpose was to anchor attention and create habit. Synchronicity journaling asked participants to carry a small notebook and note the date, time, the unusual event, and 2 contextual details. Was someone thinking about them right before a call? Did a phrase repeat across 2 conversations? Over weeks, these entries became a data set. Sophia emphasized that the journal was not proof of anything mystical. It was a training tool in observational rigor. She encouraged people to share anonymized excerpts in their local circles so patterns could be assessed without compromising privacy. Grounding meditations were 15-minute practices focused on felt connection to the body and environment. Sophia taught a simple sequence. Breathe into the feet, notice the contact with the ground, name 5 things you can feel physically, and then anchor with a slow exhale. The aim was to keep people embodied as they navigated unfamiliar perceptual terrain. In parallel, Sophia and her small team developed ethical guidelines. Always seek consent before attempting empathic contact. Do not offer medical advice. Encourage professional consultation when symptoms escalate. And never, under any circumstances, induce trance without clear, informed consent. They also emphasized that practices were optional and that people should tailor them to their own psychological and medical realities. The goal was integration, not evangelism. As the 10-week mark approached, Sophia's circle took on the structure of a grassroots observatory. They timed breath sessions at dawn and dusk, cross-referenced synchronicity logs, and collected audio from hobbyists like Ethan. Their methodology was intentionally humble: careful listening, meticulous notes, and a refusal to overinterpret single data points. The humility came not from doubt, but from strategy. If institutions were inclined to dismiss anecdotes, then the best defense was disciplined anecdotal science. Lots of small, cross-checked reports that could not be easily waved away. At the center of their ethical life was an orientation toward care. Sophia never framed the work as an urgent recruitment drive. Instead, she used agricultural metaphors: plant seeds, tend patiently, harvest responsibly. She repeated the being's invitation, prepare the grounds, as a call to cultivate communities that could receive change with curiosity, not fear. 2 weeks before the predicted peak, the group felt the pressure of the narrowing window. Reported experiences increased in frequency. A courier in the network spoke of a day when, during his lunch break, 3 different customers told him, without prompting, about a new kind of dream. A musician in Seattle found an improvisational phrase emerging unbidden during a performance and later discovered the same melodic contour popping up in 2 pieces of disparate collaborators. The accumulation of similar reports across locales was not proof of cosmic intent, but it was suggestive. Sophia also described another class of events she called validation moments. Instances where an external professional, someone outside of the circle, responded with curiosity rather than dismissal.
A general practitioner, approached by a patient who reported vivid dreams and a new clarity of thought, referred the patient to a sleep study rather than prescribing a sedative reflexively. An occupational therapist, hearing about enhanced proprioception in a client, suggested structured movement therapy rather than pathologizing the reports. These moments were small but crucial. They modeled an institutional response that was open enough to accommodate the phenomenon without prematurely medicalizing it. Still, the countermeasures Sophia had been shown in vision felt possible. She began to prepare her community for 3 likely scenarios: pathologization, where unusual experiences were reframed as mental health symptoms; distraction, where mainstream media would pivot to unrelated spectacles; and medication, where pharmacological framing might dominate the narrative. For each scenario, she suggested practical responses grounded in ethics and safety. To pathologization, she advised documentation and professional consultation. Document the experience, encourage the person to consult a clinician, and ask clinicians to consider wider contexts. To distraction, she urged persistence in community dialogues and public education, small, steady inoculations against the manners of dismissal. To medication, she counseled caution and empowerment. Encourage clinicians to explore integrative approaches when safe, and always insist on informed consent about treatments. Importantly, Sophia did not cast clinicians as enemies. Many health professionals she encountered were perplexed and curious. Several asked for anonymized case notes to consider in non-judgmental ways. Her insistence was that the first social step was to build bridges between anecdote and clinical curiosity, not to set up opposition. When the 10-week mark bled into its final days, Sophia's group organized a Preparing the Grounds gathering in a neighborhood community hall. They practiced the breath protocol together, shared anonymized journal entries, and listened to Ethan's audio samples. Marcos, who had become a steady participant, spoke briefly about his experience, not as a convert, but as someone who had noticed changes in his movement and decision-making. He emphasized practical care: schedule physiotherapy, track pain on a scale, and involve your primary care physician. The invitation was ritual-adjacent, but sober. Prepare friends, ask permission to document experiences, and form listening circles that prioritized consent and non-judgment. Participation was voluntary and free. People left with small notebooks, printed guidelines, and a sense that they were part of a quieter, distributed observatory. Then came the 48-hour window. What followed was, in Sophia's words, less like a single tsunami and more like a pattern of pulses that interacted with human attention and cultural framing. In their circle's logs, there were clusters, a spike in reports of vivid dreams, several musicians describing similar melodic phrases, and a handful of healthcare professionals writing about unexpected variance in recovery rates for patients already in care. Etham's radio log showed an uptick in structured waveform activity at times that overlapped with some of the subjective reports. Again, none of these data proved a universal metaphysical claim. They did, however, create a narrative context that required sober attention. Media reaction followed a pattern that echoed Sophia's predictions. Some outlets leaned into sensationalism, framing stories as either apocalyptic awakenings or mass hysteria. Others focused on technical parameters, trajectory, composition, and expert skepticism. Within that mixture, people who had participated in the community found themselves situated in a new social landscape. Some were met with curiosity, others with dismissal. Sophia's group continued its core practice: validate first, document second, and seek professional counsel when appropriate.
Predictably, there were attempts, socially and rhetorically, to pathologize. Columns and think pieces argued that the surge of reports fit known patterns of mass suggestion, and calls for caution circulated across platforms. There were also pockets of constructive engagement. University clinics expressed interest in anonymized data sets. A small interdisciplinary seminar invited Sophia to present her observational methods alongside sleep researchers and anthropologists. Institutions behaved as they often do, in multiple, conflicting ways. Within the circle, the ethical work became central. People sought support for integration rather than validation alone. Sophia developed a short integration checklist for those who felt the activation keenly. 1. Consult primary health care if experiencing new or troubling physical symptoms. 2. Maintain daily grounding practices. 3. Avoid major life decisions in the immediate aftermath of intense experiences. And 4. Seek community validation and, if helpful, therapeutic support. These were practical, harm-minimizing measures rather than attempts to dampen awe. In the weeks after the peak, some of the predicted countermeasures surfaced more clearly. There were editorials that questioned the authenticity of the audio samples. A narrative of mass delusion gained traction in some corners. A small number of clinics reported increased inquiries about sleep disturbances and offered pharmaceutical interventions as first-line responses. The pattern Sophia had warned about, containment through clinical framing, appeared in certain institutional responses, at least temporarily. Yet the story did not resolve into singular outcomes. Many people reported continued, incremental shifts that did not lend themselves to easy categorization.
The programmer's capacity for rapid debugging persisted and, with corroboration from peers, became something he incorporated into his professional narrative. The musician who had heard a recurring phrase found it weaving into collaborative work and attributed increased creative fluency to a combination of practice and recurring inspiration. Lena, the nurse, continued to document odd recovery curves and encouraged clinical colleagues to adopt an open noticing stance rather than reflexive medication. The political narrative, whether institutions had intentionally framed Atlas as inert to prevent panic, remained unresolved in public records. Sophia's visionary reconstruction remained her testimony, a perceptual experience she conveyed in careful terms. Some listeners treated it as sufficient, others demanded documentary proof. Both responses are valid within the story's logic. What followed the peak was what Sophia called the season of sorting. Individuals, communities, and institutions began to make choices. Some people leaned into integration practices and community validation. Others reverted to normative frameworks that emphasized skepticism and risk management. Both paths had consequences. Those who integrated with care reported increased resilience to the kinds of disorienting episodes that originally produced fear. Those who pathologized often experienced short-term clarity born of containment but missed opportunities for communal learning, Sophia thought. Sophia's recommendation throughout was a practice of layered responses: curiosity at the individual level, documentation at the community level, and an invitation to clinicians and researchers to treat emergent reports as potential data, worthy of study rather than ridicule. She urged humility. She emphasized boundaries. She insisted that empowerment does not mean improvisation without safeguards. Her final months of public work were less about proclamation and more about infrastructure. She produced short educational pamphlets for clinicians that described how to listen to patients reporting unusual experiences without prematurely medicating. She partnered with a sleep clinic to design anonymized intake forms that included questions about recent shifts in dream intensity and uncanny coincidences. And she started writing. First a series of essays, then the longer ebook that she eventually made available about integrating extraordinary experiences into ordinary life. When I asked her what she thought the broader cultural lesson might be, she answered with the modesty that had marked her from the beginning. We are being asked to learn to listen differently, not only to voices that speak out loud, but to the subtle ways attention moves through us. That requires practice, community, and a new kind of humility. Before she left the public stage to work with a small cohort of practitioners and clinicians, Sophia convened one last gathering in the community hall. It was not a rally.
There were no proclamations of salvation. People sat in a wide circle. They practiced the breath sequence in unison. They journaled and then passed their notebooks around, reading anonymous excerpts. They tried one careful, consent-based empathic exercise. Partners sat, each took turns describing a recent unusual experience. The listener offered the three phrases, "I hear you," "This might be important," and "Would you like to sit with me while we record what happened?" And then both wrote down one small, verifiable follow-up to check in a week later. The atmosphere was simple, a civic ritual of listening. Marcos, who had become more than a patient in Sophia's narrative, stood near the doorway as people left. He was quieter now, less struck by awe, and more engaged in a day-to-day stewardship of well-being. "It asked me to be present," he said softly. "That feels like enough." The recording of Sophia's talks, the audio samples, the journals, and the guidelines she created, these became the core materials she offered in two forms: a public ebook for those who wanted structured guidance, and private consultations for people needing personalized integration support. Her closing words in the community hall were not a call to arms, but a call to presence and care. Prepare the grounds, tend the soil, and listen. I must reiterate what I opened with. This account is a testimony, an eyewitness sequence given by Sophia and supported by community notes. It includes visionary reconstructions, audio anomalies collected by amateur radio operators, and patterns described by clinicians and laypeople alike. It does not, as of the writing of this account, constitute an independently verified scientific dossier, attesting to the intentional manufacture of 3I Atlas or to a definitive causal chain between any orbital object and human biological change. Where Sophia offers technical-sounding language, 528 Hz, dormant DNA, harmonic activation, she does so as the interpretation of a perceptual experience. She frames these elements as a hypothesis she invites others to test, document, and discuss. If you take nothing else from this testimony, take this practical ethical counsel. First, validation is a low-cost, high-impact act. When a friend reports a strange dream or a new clarity, listen. Use the three phrases. Second, document. If we want uncertain phenomena to be taken seriously, we must develop methods of disciplined anecdotal collection that can be offered to clinicians and researchers as raw material. Third, care for bodies and minds. If physical or psychological symptoms emerge, seek professional help and maintain safety as the first principle. Finally, if Sophia's account has resonated with you, or if you have had experiences that feel related, there are resources she put together that you can consult. The ebook, Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence, collects her practices, journals, and a method for building community observatories. She also offers limited private consultations for integration work. Sessions designed to help people map experiences, create safety plans, and connect with appropriate medical or psychological care when necessary. This is a long and messy human moment, one that touches on science, spirituality, and the politics of disclosure. Whether Atlas is a manufactured transmitter or a remarkable comet, or whether the truth occupies some third space, does not, in the end, relieve us of the ethical choices before us. Sophia's testimony insists on two converging responsibilities: to approach strange experiences with rigorous curiosity, and to respond to those who report them with compassion rather than contempt. The last time I spoke to Sophia, she was quieter than when this began. The urgency had not left her, but it had softened into a steady work of tending. She showed me a small packet of notes, pages from her notebook where she had copied phrases from participants that later matched phrases in other journals. "Plant seeds," she said. "Tend them, see which grow, and don't be afraid to ask for help when the weather turns."
On clear nights now, when the sky is visible and the object cataloged as 3-eye atlas arcs in the telescope's feeds, people look up with different questions. Some ask for proof. Others ask for guidance. Sophia, who once only worked at the scale of a single session, now spends her days building listening circles, training clinicians in non-pathologizing approaches, and helping ordinary people navigate extraordinary experiences. "You are not here by chance," she often says, "not as a promise of destiny, but as a reminder of responsibility. The world is not simply something that happens to you, it is something you help enact by how you respond." If you would like the practical material Sophia developed, the breath protocol, the synchronicity journaling template, sample consent scripts for empathic exercises, and curated audio samples for personal study, her ebook compiles them into a single resource. For those seeking one-on-one guidance in integrating an experience, she accepts a limited number of consultations designed to connect people to local clinical resources, community circles, and personalized grounding plans. Whatever you decide to do with this testimony, consider beginning with these steps. Listen first, document carefully, and seek professional support when physical or psychological symptoms are pronounced. Above all, remember consent and community. Strange things can be frightening when faced alone. They become navigable when held with others who will not rush to dismiss. Sophia's final telepathic message, as she quoted it to me months after the peak, was simple and striking. "Prepare the grounds. The tone arrives. Remember who you were." Whether Atlas is a device, a comet, a mythic mirror, or something in between, the invitation remains. Prepare, listen, and choose with clarity and compassion how we will meet whatever arrives.